So, Europe in 1700 is still a mess, but it's a more controlled mess. I mean, some countries have become nations, okay? Especially Austria, France, England, Spain. Those are the biggest countries in Central and Western Europe. The Ottomans are still the biggest empire in this area. In fact, the only places I would call empires are the Ottoman and Austria, because they include multiple nationalities. Germany still 100 plus states. Italy fewer than in the past, but only because they've been colonized. This is all Spanish, eventually French. This will be Austria. Oh, I'm sorry, 300 states in Germany. The biggest of these states is Prussia. And Prussia gets involved and actually becomes regional power after this war. The 7 Years' War, to me, is almost the first world war. The first war you can really call world war, because it also has an impact on the colonies, which are outside Europe, British and French colonies. So Britain gets something from France outside Europe. And they involve all of those powers except Spain. Then, of course, the big thing is the independence, the birth of the United States and the French Revolution, one after the other. Both have very similar goals from different perspectives, but liberty, self-determination, and an egalitarian spirit. Then in France it doesn't go well, because first you have the terror, and then you have Napoleon. Napoleon was another interesting experiment. To this day it's really hard to decide if it was a good experiment or bad experiment. At the time, the rulers decided it was a really bad experiment because he invaded all of them, kicked them out of their job. That's also the time when Hispanic America stops being Spanish and Portuguese. So besides the USA, actually, there are a lot more independence movements back then that sometimes we forget. Population of California is 5,000. I don't know the population of the Bay Area. I suspect it was really, really teeny. It's hard to believe it was only 200 years ago. So 7 Years' War already mentioned. That's the major war at the time until the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars were, technically speaking, crazy. It was France against everybody. And then the war in Eastern Europe, as I mentioned before, Russia and the Ottomans kept fighting for supremacy. And Russia is really the country that kept denting that empire. So one of the reasons why the Ottomans started retreating was the constant wars with Russia. Although the very last one on this thing was actually interesting, because the Christian power sided with the Ottomans against Russia, which tells you two things. One, Russia has become a threat. The first time that Russia is perceived as a threat by the rest of Europe. And two, the Ottomans have become European. The Ottoman Empire has evolved to the point that the Christian powers don't see them as the Muslims. They're just one of the powers. And in fact, that's the time when the Ottomans behave, they want to be Western.
What's driving all of these wars? Trade advantage? It doesn't seem like religion's driving it anymore.
Yeah, that's another good question. At this point, it's really the beginning of the national identity. It's nations that fight over territory.
Okay.
So in many cases, the specific cause is not enough to justify the whole war. It's just that this country was just waiting for an excuse to invade the territory of another country. Yeah, so it's more about borders at this point.
Okay.
Not all of them, but in general. Napoleon, in theory, had also an ideological purpose, to remove the kings and create a more democratic world. But at the end of the day, he was trying to create a French empire over the whole of Europe. So if you look from outside, you have two empires that are disintegrating. Spain and Portugal will disappear very quickly. One that is expanding, the British Empire. And that by the end of this evening will be the big story, politically speaking. So it's already, South Africa eventually will be all of this. It's expanding in India. It's beginning to invade, to colonize Australia. What's happening in England? Well, these are fascinating stories. There's no really major idea behind this. What you see is that I told you about this little metal revolution in England. You know, that England is making more metal goods than the rest of Europe. And then they started making machines for the textile industry, which in those days was the main industry, not all in England. And so you have these improvements in the textile industry. And they resulted in a massive increase in exports, specifically of cotton. And that has widespread consequences. So first of all, the revolution happens initially here. Okay? This is really where a lot of those textile innovations start. What is special about this area? It's really hard to tell. Right? The only big city nearby is Manchester. It's far from London. It's far from the capital. And then it moves here when you have the cast iron factories. So then iron eventually becomes important, you will see in a second why. So the only thing you can notice is that Birmingham, where is it? Birmingham, it's south of Manchester. And Birmingham had this lunar society, and out of the lunar society you will get the steam engine, the gas light, cast iron boats, the cast iron boat. This was not really a scientific academy. It was not a university. It was more like a club of people who were really intrigued by technology. Nothing to compare with the French Academy of Science. Okay. What was special about Manchester? Well, people put together these things. Water mills, it had water mills. It had coal mines nearby. It had the port of Liverpool nearby. And it had technology. Which technology? Very interesting. Clock making. Okay? It was a traditional. In England, Manchester was the place where people were making clocks. Another place was Nuremberg in Germany. Well, Manchester was the place in England. And those clockmakers are the ones who started the Industrial Revolution. Those are the ones who started building machines. The middle class was running most of these early enterprises. Yeah, so cotton skyrockets. And of course the big thing is the steam engine. They start building factories. In fact, did I skip the first factory? Probably. This is the guy who built the first thing that we would call a factory. And factories multiply because all that cotton is becoming a very lucrative business. And the one problem is the demand for iron increases dramatically. Traditionally, they were using wood and to fuel the furnaces. They ran out of wood. This already started in the age of Elizabeth I. And then the replacement is coal. And then coal becomes the big thing. Coal mining has a problem. Water. You have to pump water out of the mines. Steam engine was originally invented to solve that problem. So originally the steam engine was invented to pump water out of coal mines. And that became a huge problem because coal was becoming the fuel of England. This was happening all in England. So indirectly, the steam engine was an invention, was a consequence of deforestation. Steam engine had been invented before, but James Watt is the one usually recognized because he improved that invention to the point that it became useful commercially. And in very few years, you see a lot of applications of the steam engine, of his steam engine. So it was a powerful technological innovation. And that really changed the way the textile industry works. Instead of the water wheel, you have the steam power, the steam engine. And that has consequences, wide ranges of consequences. The first one is just the location. When it was powered by water, when industry was powered by water, you had to be near a river. And when you have the steam engine that is powering the industry, you don't need to be near the river. You need to be near the place of commerce and where people are, where you can hire people. So it moves to the city. The original Industrial Revolution, when it was water-based, did not cause a massive movement, the massive movement that we usually identify from rural to urban society. But the steam engine did. Yeah, by the way, another big advantage was also that the same application, pumping water out of the coal mines, applied to fresh water, pumping fresh water into the cities. That was a major improvement, actually. I think the first one was in Paris. Maybe it's on one of the next slides. It was a major improvement in the quality of life. You had easily fresh water available in cities without waiting for rain, regardless of how far you were from the river. And of course, steam power eventually will revolutionize transportation for the same reason, actually. The first railways were built to transport coal. So indirectly, it all goes back to coal. The first railways, in fact, were wooden railways built way back at the time of Elizabeth I. But once you use iron, you have the railways as we think of them today, traveling at a ridiculous speed that we here still have with Caltrain. But so it all starts with coal edge indirectly. So then you have a loop, a very interesting loop. You have steam engines are made of metal, so you need even more iron, right? How do you make iron? They start using steam engines. So you have an infinite loop where the more steam engines you make, the more iron you produce. The more iron you produce, the more steam engines you can make. And this eventually causes a collapse in the price of iron. So Britain becomes #1 in cast iron. So the factory, then you have the factories. Then you put the steam engines together, and you get a factory where labor is organized. Initially, so that's the other big side effect of the steam engine I wanted to talk about. The factory. You create the factory, and who works in the factory? Initially was women and children. But eventually you have a population of workers. Initially women and children, then just the non-specialized workers. So first of all, non-specialized workers. The big difference when you start using machines to this day is that you need fewer and fewer skills. You're no longer the carpenter who has to perfect a good. There's a machine that does something, and operating the machine is actually relatively easy. So you can use unskilled labor. And unskilled labor originally was women and children, I guess just because they were the cheapest form of labor available. But eventually, women, men, children, that becomes a new social class, the factory worker. So indirectly, the steam engine ends up creating a new social class.
So the steam-powered cotton mill, that's like all mechanically powered machines.
Well, that
it has to be, right? Because electricity wasn't there yet.
Yeah, no electricity. I mean, some of the earliest cars were propelled by steam. Immigrants came to America on steamships. You can do amazing things with steam. You probably cannot fly planes, but other than that, you can do a lot of things with that power. The inventors are ordinary people. That's also a major evolution. So that something in the English society has opened up to the point that a poor weaver or a barber can become a rich person in manufacturing. Okay, the labor force. So they create a new social class, and so eventually it would be called the proletariat. And that becomes a big deal because very rapidly you start having overcrowded factory towns. Working conditions are horrible. At one point, I think the work week was 60 hours, which today is what we have in Silicon Valley, actually. And so then intellectuals start writing about it. They start writing about the fact that we're creating hell the cities are no longer what they used to be. They become a horrible place to live. And one of these guys will go on to write the Communist Manifesto with Marx. So that's the beginning of a whole new kind of ideology there. Eventually, Britain does something, you know, especially after the great stink of London, when it was impossible to breathe in London. Then at the same time, it creates another social class. I mean, there are people who make a lot of money out of this. They are the factory owners, they are the people who build railroads, they are the people who move goods, import, export, bankers, the people who fund industry. And at some point you also have the engineers, the class of engineers gets a little better, although back then it was really still very primitive. So these people end up creating another social class. It's not the aristocracy, it's not the land-owning aristocracy of the past. They don't own land, they own business. So it creates the higher middle class. Then it also causes the transportation revolution. You have the first major steamships, the first locomotive. The improvement was not that dramatic at the beginning, by the way. I think the first one that traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, maybe I have it, took 1 month. Columbus took 2 months without even knowing where he was going. So the improvement initially was not that big, but you know, give it enough. Yeah, the Savannah, first transatlantic crossing in 28 days. But eventually will make a difference. And in 1838, a regular transatlantic ship service begins. Now, so that's a very rapid idea. So it starts with the textile industry. Textile industry is important all over Europe, but somehow it's in England that they start mechanizing the textile industry. And we can discuss forever why England. I gave you some ideas. You know, during the age of Elizabeth, they started using a lot of iron, not for luxury goods, not for the king, for ordinary people to build pots and pans. Then you have deforestation that causes a need for coal, and coal is a fuel, and coal mines need this problem with the water. You have to pump the water out. And at the same time, in England, both the crown and the church have lost power. The economic, in France, this could not happen because the king would have had to decide, let's do an industrial revolution. In England, there's this vacuum of power where the middle class can have ideas and make money with those ideas. It's a different system. Okay? So you put all of this together, maybe you get an explanation. Before the Industrial Revolution, England was not the superpower that became with the British Empire. It becomes the British Empire because of the Industrial Revolution. So let's not confuse cause and effect. When the Industrial Revolution starts, Britain is nowhere near the top. But the big question becomes this. If you look at the bigger thing, the booms of civilization so far have always happened in warm countries. Think of Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, Rome, Indus Valley, Yellow River Valley in China, the Islamic world. It's always that belt that runs north of the equator, but in warm places. Okay? The moment you get to cold places, my story is very brief. What was happening in Russia? What was happening in Scandinavia? Yeah, there was somebody conquering territory. The story pretty much ends there. Here, something different happens. With the Industrial Revolution, it spreads from Britain to Scandinavia, Holland, Germany. Eventually, Germany will become the main competitor. But Southern Europe will be very late at adopting the Industrial Revolution. And the Islamic world would be one of the big losers. So why? You can have your own opinion. I mean, one of the most widespread opinions is Catholics and Protestants. But you know, it changes something there. And to this day, the United States is a colder country compared with Mexico, which was the place of the Maya. So it's just the cold countries become more. You tend to think of the north as being more developed than the south. But historically, that was not the case. It was the opposite. The north was with the barbarians. Okay. Another possibility, of course, that we just got better at adapting to cold weather, so that was not a factor anymore, and maybe there was an advantage suddenly in being cold weather. I'll let you speculate. Okay, nobody has the one-sentence solution to this thing. Now, you mentioned electricity. Actually, this is the age where we don't know how to use electricity. We don't know what it is, but they start studying it. And this all comes from the scientific revolution that was going on before, from the Descartes, Bacon, Leonardo before them. I mean, curiosity. People become very curious about finding out the nature of things. So they know that there is electricity, and they find that electricity is more widespread than you think. So they find Benjamin Franklin, the lightning rod. They find that there is electricity in nature in different forms. Alessandro Volta in Italy invents the battery, and the battery does something amazing. It converts chemical energy into electricity. So then they realize that there's some connection between chemistry and electricity, between chemical forces and electrical forces. Faraday is the big one in this story, because he realizes that there's a connection between electricity and magnetism. That was not obvious before, but he realizes that you can do something with those two things combined. So he invents the dynamo that can actually can work. So that's the beginning of the electrical motor, in a sense. The concept is there. And then proves that all electricities are the same. He starts thinking of the universe as invaded by a field of electromagnetic substance. Okay, so it's very close to explaining the puzzle. Maxwell will do to him what Newton did to Galileo. All these intuitions were correct. It takes somebody to write the equations that mathematicians can use. But they're studying electricity. At the same time, they study chemistry. This is the beginning of chemistry that picks with Lavoisier. And they discover hydrogen, oxygen, but very important if you think of the psychology of ordinary people. The four elements, right? Since Greek times, the four elements, water, these are the fundamental elements: water, air, fire, earth. Now, forget earth, that they already knew it's a big mess. But now you find out that none of this is a fundamental element. They explain that water and air are not elements, but compounds. Today everybody knows this, right? Oxygen plus hydrogen. Lavoisier explained that fire is just something, a process that happens with you combined with the oxygen. So those three fundamental elements are not elementary anymore. And then eventually John Dalton comes out and says, actually the fundamental elements are something that eventually will be explained as atoms and that form molecules and so on. So that's a big change in the way people think of the world. At the same time, for ordinary people, one of the big revolutions was lighting. I mentioned in one of the previous slides that another thing that came out of that club in Birmingham was gas lighting. That's not the detail. Lighting back then was still candles, and candles had very limited usability, and they have their own problems. With gas lighting, you can light up the entire city. In fact, that's what they did eventually. There was gas lighting everywhere, and ordinary homes would have, one here, a lamp here, a lamp there, and you could read till very late, and you could work till very late. And as long as the fuel was cheap, which would remain for a century, everybody could do this. So that must have a huge impact on ordinary lives. Now, in terms of thinking, Adam Smith lived in that age, and it's not surprising they came up with the idea that free markets are the best way to do business, and that guess what, the government should stay out of the way, that there's the invisible hand of the market is the one that should drive the economy and so on. Why did he come up with those ideas? Now it should be obvious. He was living that thing. He was in the country where the government had the least impact on the economy. He lived in the country where the market had just proven this theory. So it was heavily influenced by the place where he lived. You know, it just formalized what was going on around him. And incidentally, he was also probably instrumental in the independence of the United States, because there was a debate in England before 1776, where some people were complaining that it was not worth having the American colonies. Just from an economic point of view, it was not worth it. And Adam Smith was probably the most influential. So there was actually a discussion going on, trying to convince the king that those colonies are not worth it. No, it's right here. Anyway, that's trivia. Now, this is not trivia, this is a big story actually, that I left here because I wanted to do it all together. It actually starts way back. Sugar, at one point, was the oil of the world. Was the most valuable commodity. And yeah, so these are some numbers. So the consumption went from almost zero, only the king has sugar, to too much, okay? So the history starts way back. So it starts at some point. The Arabs learned how to create sugar plantations, especially in Lebanon, and this was a very lucrative business for them. Then the Crusades come. Well, during the Crusades, the Italians learned about the sugar plantations. They learned the theory and the practice of sugar plantations. Unfortunately, the Christians lose the Crusades. They're kicked out of Lebanon. The Italians have learned how to do it. They know how to do that business. They know it's a lucrative business. They just need another place where to do it. Eventually, the king of Portugal tells the Italians, okay, I have this island of Madeira, and you can do whatever, you can experiment there. The Italians realize it's perfect weather. They go to Madeira, probably enslaving the local population, and they create sugar plantations. Again, big business. Portugal totally convinced that this was a great idea. At the same time, Portugal is exploring the coast of Africa, and they get to the island São Tomé, to the island of São Tomé. To the island of São Tomé off the coast of West Africa. It's a Portuguese colony. It will remain a Portuguese colony for a long time. They repeat the experiment. Sugar plantations, except this time they use local slaves. That's the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, literally. Because at that point, all they do is export the same model to Brazil using local slaves and African slaves. And they quickly find out that the African slaves are better workers than the American slaves. And so the African slaves become very valued labor. So the Portuguese start buying slaves. By the way, half of the story is not told, that the African kingdoms sold the slaves. We only hear the second part of the story, the horrible travel and the horrible conditions in the Americas. But it was a trade that had been going on since forever, I guess. So the original purpose of the Atlantic slave trade was really the sugar plantations. Brazil is a huge country, and you can have as much sugar as you like. And initially Portugal was the main slave trading country of Europe, by far, way before Britain. Then eventually Britain caught up, and where were the sugar plantations of Britain? And then also France, Caribbeans. So the Barbados, Jamaica, those were the valuable colonies of Britain. Britain granted the 13 colonies independence, but never granted independence to Barbados until 1960, something like that. Barbados' GDP was way higher than the 13 colonies combined. from a strategic point of view, there was a huge difference. Those 13 colonies are just troublemakers. Barbados is a cash cow. Big difference, okay? And same for France, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint-Dominique. Those teeny Caribbean islands that were very actually big sugar producers, and sugar was a big thing. So from 1713 to 1822, somebody wrote that West Indies being the Caribbeans, lead Asia, Africa, and North America in commodities exported to Britain. So then you have the US plantations. The difference in the US plantations is that the US has to diversify because of climatic reasons. So instead of having just sugar, you have tobacco, cotton, which eventually become much, much bigger things. But the model is really exactly the model that the Portuguese adopted, that the Italians, unfortunately, pioneered. So it comes from actually the sugar plantation. It just becomes large scale, it becomes much bigger. I mean, the numbers get much bigger in the United States. In terms of cruelty and stuff, I'm not even sure if it's worse, because we have fewer documents of the original slave trade, the Portuguese one, which was probably not any more humane. Anyway, that's where it started, sugar. So it's another trivia that is interesting. So sugar by 1800 has become a necessity. Ordinary people expect to have sugar, and tells you, Britain, 9 kilograms per person per year, France not even 1 kilogram. Okay, so that's the story of sugar. The Atlantic slave trade really starts with sugar. There was the oil at the time. Anyway, meanwhile, Britain is expanding very quickly, and one reason is the Industrial Revolution. Britain is becoming a rich country and is using that power in many ways. As I said, the empire actually was originally built by private companies. It's only later that the king decides, okay, let's make it an empire, and eventually the queen, Queen Victoria. The problem the British Empire had from the very beginning is that it claimed to be bringing civilization to these countries, in particular to be bringing freedom to these countries, which sounds ironic, right? We are colonizing. But that was the spirit, that Britain was the first democratic country, and now as we invade you, we teach you how to be civilized. So indirectly, they were planting the seeds of their own demise, because eventually you will have people like Gandhi reminding them, hello, you told us that freedom is good. Anyway, it was a very interesting experiment while it lasted. Global communications, they used, the British Empire was using steamships, railroads, telegraph, eventually telegraph, undersea cable, and so on and so on. It was a worldwide empire. That's the difference with the Mongols and, with the terrestrial empires. This was an empire that had to cross oceans. So it could not have happened without the Industrial Revolution, without the steam engine, without the steamship, without the railroads. It needed all of these things in order to exist. They created a worldwide logistical system that was not trivial. And again, it was a small country controlling a huge territory, and eventually, once they got to India, a huge population. So that's going on. What's going on in France? Well, one thing is important. In France, the intellectuals are very jealous of England. The situation has really reversed itself. For a long time, Southern Europe looked at Northern Europe as barbarians, uncultured, dumb, backwards. Now it has changed. Where does Voltaire go in exile? London. So one thing is happening is what in French we call the Les Lumières, and we commonly call enlightenment. And that comes from all those philosophers who were mostly from Northern Europe, but now those ideas are beginning to trickle down into France. And the way they do is actually very interesting, because Britain has already created I don't know if I want to do, yeah. Britain has already created public opinion. Britain has newspapers, magazines, not the way they are today, but they have public opinion. That's how Locke and Hume and the others discuss things. Adam Smith, and books are published on subjects that people discuss. In France, this starts happening despite the fact that the king probably didn't like it. So that's an interesting way of creating public opinion. And one place where public opinion was created was actually the salons, mostly run by women, where important people like Voltaire and Diderot and so on would assemble and discuss new ideas. And that was largely outside the control of the king, and despite the fact that many of these salons were run by aristocratic women. So you start having people like La Mettrie, who thinks this is the ultimate materialist. The mind is a machine, everything is a machine, the whole universe is a machine. It's the ultimate extremist in terms of materialism. And Georges Buffon does not hesitate to say that the Bible is a bunch of it's fiction, that actually fossils are past animals. The Earth is a lot older than 6,000 years, and the Earth evolved, animals evolved, and so on and so on. Okay? It doesn't have the scientific evidence for this. It's just based on intuition, based on what it says. But you can say it. Okay? It's a different atmosphere. Voltaire is the most famous of this. He does believe in a God that created the universe, but it's not the God of the Bible or the God of the Quran. It's a God that, he sees it as ridiculous to think that a God would take mud and create Adam and then take a rib. That's, to him, we got to the point that people are rational, and he doesn't believe this story. This story is ridiculous. God has better things to do than care about us, and he certainly cannot be bribed by humans. The idea that I pray, I'm good, or when I die, I give money to the church, and then I can go to paradise. He finds all of this ridiculous. So it's called deism. He does believe there is a God, there is a creator, whatever, but it's none of these religions. All of these religions to him are superstition. That's the right word. So he carries out a moral crusade against intolerance, tyranny, superstition. He sees the church as a monster, the state is a monster. If you think he's a Democrat, I'll caution you that actually did not like democracy. He was scared actually even of the newspapers spreading information, and he did not believe that the masses are good for running the government. But he conducted this campaign against tyranny and church. That's why he ended up in London instead of, he would have had a very short life if he had stayed in France. So freedom of thought, he addresses the masses, not the elite. So in that sense, he has, freedom of thought is a famous sentence, I don't agree at all with what you say, but I'm willing to lose my life to defend your right to say it. Okay? There's, lots of politicians have paraphrased that sentence. So the Enlightenment discredited religion, discredited the ancient regime, the ancien regime, which is the king, the royalty, so on. So it was very important to change the intellectual discussion. And obviously the emphasis was on science. So the public sphere is a long discussion, but the public opinion is created. And how many people were actually involved in this public opinion? It's not like today where you can poll anybody. It was probably still a minority. But more and more people were reading novels, even Charles Dickens' novels, Balzac novels. They embody a sociological, if not political, discussion. That were newspapers, books becoming entertainment. So, ideas spread. They spread not necessarily to the workers of the factory, probably cannot read and write, but they spread to the people who can start a revolution. That, yes. And in the United States, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Tom Paine, they were deists, meaning they were not really good old-fashioned Christians. The U.S. Revolution is a practical application of the Enlightenment. it's kind of funny, starting in France, then it was applied in the United States, then it went back to France. So how did the Bible lose credibility? Number one, as I said, America is not mentioned in the Bible. Number two, when a new star appeared in the sky, then we colonized the other continents, and we find out those people never heard of Jesus. It was taken for granted that everybody knew Jesus was the Savior and all his miracles and resurrection. And then in the age of rationality, there are obvious contradictions between the Old and New Testament to this day. To this day, the church has to explain which one is right. I mean, eye for an eye or the other cheek. Those are two completely different attitudes. So anyway, so definitely that's the impact of the Enlightenment. It really deprives the church of any credibility. Everything that is in the Bible can be discussed, and some of it might be true, but anything is up for discussion. And then it deprives the monarchy of its legitimacy. Okay? And the net effect will be eventually the French Revolution. Eventually, these ideas will keep self-inflating until all it takes is a spark, and then you have people revolting against the regime. Meanwhile, lots of things happening. In mathematics, this guy invents the theory of probabilities. Fourier invents one of the most important things, but it's hard to explain. That this is used daily in your smartphones. It's in any electronic device. And these mathematicians start studying non-Euclidean geometries. These are all far-fetched ideas, actually. I don't want to discuss each of them because it will take an hour each. But the idea that you start doubting even the fundamental mathematician of all times. I mean, that book has been dogma even more than the Catholic Church. Okay, you know that what a line is, what a triangle is, what a circle is. You know exactly the equations that rule in geometry. And this man says, well, you know what? It could be that that's not the only possible geometry. So, lots of ideas going on. Lamarck introduces also the idea of evolution, that animals evolved. This is before Darwin. Before Darwin, there were many that had similar idea. He's the first one whom you would consider a scientist of evolution. And a lot of what he said is what Darwin said. The big difference that Lamarck thought that you can pass what you learn to your children. Okay, what Darwin added is mutation and selection. So we are at the point where some people start doubting the story. Some people start saying, well, the Earth must have its own story. Okay, it wasn't created like that. It evolved, and through volcanoes, earthquakes, I don't know, but it evolved. It took a lot longer than 6,000 years. Some people say that animals evolved. People are seeing the universe change. These are all things that are having a huge impact on the mind of people, depriving the authorities of the past of their credibility and legitimacy. Okay, so it's a very important age, actually. So you have the French Revolution, and the French Revolution is mostly a sad story because it starts with noble intentions, and then, as you probably know, it goes into the terror, Robespierre. Most of the people who were killed in the French Revolution were actually not aristocrats and not priests, just middle class. This happens over and over in revolutions with good intentions. So eventually it ends with Napoleon. Napoleon seizes power, restores order, and so in theory, the French Revolution, the French Revolution achieved its goals. You know, that it finally destroyed feudalism. I mean, the king of France had survived, was the descendant of the king of the feudal times, except he had a lot more power. Richelieu had concentrated power in the king, but it was still the feudal mindset. And with the French Revolution, that dies. The king is out. There's the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church, they're out. But again, it doesn't end well. Okay, so the next experiment is Napoleon. Eventually, he seizes power. Napoleon is different, completely different from the king. Right? If you think of Napoleon as just another king, that's not correct. He had no desire of becoming a king. He wanted to become an emperor, which is better. But not the traditional monarch. And the traditional monarch, your son is going to be the next king, or your daughter. But that was not what Napoleon had in mind. He wanted, in theory, he wanted to bring freedom. He's another one who wants to bring freedom to people, and so he invades and conquers. And but wherever he conquered, he did some of these things. I mean, he did introduce reforms in the countries that he invaded. And he invaded most of Europe. All this. And as you know, he tried to invade Russia. That's where he failed. So that's why I was saying Napoleon was an interesting experiment. It's very hard to judge. Of course, the monarchs of Europe thought of him the way we think of Hitler. It's the worst possible thing. And he was trying to completely upset the order and destroy monarchies that had existed for centuries. How ordinary people saw him, it's hard to tell, because from the point of view of an ordinary person, it was one ruler going out and a new ruler coming in. But a lot of intellectuals, the people who could read and write, welcomed him enthusiastically. Like Italy was occupied by all these foreign powers. When Napoleon came, many Italians thought he's bringing us something better than what we had before. Some people saw it as creating this federation of free people. What he spread indirectly, so his words remained. I assume you know that eventually Britain won, and which is kind of funny that Britain eventually won, because Britain was never invaded by Napoleon. But anyway, it's a long story too. But so Napoleon had spread some ideas. I mean, whether he really believed in those ideas or not, the ideas stayed. So indirectly, he fostered the nationalist ambitions of people. There were a lot of people who felt oppressed by monarchs or foreign countries. And throughout the 19th century, what you see is one liberation movement after the other, one revolution after the other. I'm Italian. Italy, 1861 is when Italy is united. 1848 is when the process begins, where Italians say, we want to be independent of foreign countries, and we want to be one nation. That's so close to Napoleon. In Germany, same